The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the NYRA Bets presented Kentucky Derby webinar from Daily Racing Form. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatal, and I'm joined on this call by two very special guests, two guys I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, and I'm really looking forward to picking their brains about their thoughts on the 2017 Kentucky Derby. We have with us from Timeform US, the head figure maker. We've had the chance to work together a whole bunch lately, and I'm thrilled he's here tonight. He is Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you this evening, Peter?
Doing very well. Doing very well. It's, I've got Derby fever and very excited to get a chance to talk about this race and get into how we might approach it from a betting standpoint. We're also joined by the main Triple Crown correspondent. You know him from his work on television. You know him from his fantastic work in the pages of Daily Racing Form. He is Jay Privman. Jay, how are you tonight?
Good, Pete. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. So, Jay, we'll start with you. What's going on? What's going on down in the state of Kentucky? What are we thinking in terms of the general vibes and the weather forecast for the next few days? What are we hearing about it?
Well, the weather's certainly going south based on the forecast from the Weather Channel. It's supposed to really start raining hard tonight throughout Thursday and into Friday as well, which is Oaks Day. It's supposed to improve on Friday, but by improve, that means a smaller percentage, but still a fairly significant chance of rain. So the one good thing about Churchill Downs as the main track is it does tend to dry out quickly. So it's really kind of difficult on Wednesday night to predict what the track will be like on Saturday, but it certainly looks like it's going to take quite a bit of moisture over the next couple of days.
We'll have to do our best in taking some guesses as to exactly what's going to happen weather-wise over the course of the next 72 hours. Before we go through this field runner by runner, I just wanted to mention again that the official sponsor of this webinar is NYRA Bets, and I wanted to talk about, you can see it on your screen there now, the $200 sign-up bonus that's going on right now. You can get in on the action by opening a NYRA Bets wagering account for a limited time. Join today and earn a $200 bonus. Getting the bonus is easy. Just use promo code TCDRF200 and bet $200 and you'll get $200. Bet the Derby through the Triple Crown and beyond while betting anytime, anywhere, nationwide. Go to nyrabets.com, enter the promo code TCDRF200 and qualify for our exclusive Bet 200, Get 200 sign-up promotion. We're going to go through this field in post-position order, and that leaves us with number one, Looking at Lee, installed at 20-1 on the morning line. Before we talk about Looking at Lee specifically, Jay, I wanted to ask you, it seems in recent years that the consensus is drawing the rail in the Kentucky Derby, let's just put it mildly, not a good thing. Where do you stand on the idea that the rail is a death sentence in terms of one's chances of victory in this race?
I think it just depends on the horse. And actually for this horse specifically, I think it doesn't matter. He's actually like the right kind of horse to get the rail because no matter where he drew, he was going to drop back to last anyway. So to me, it was a perfectly fine post for him. It would have been a more challenging one for a horse who has tactical speed or needs to be on the lead because there your options are so limited. If you don't quite break well, then it could compromise you. But for Looking at Lee, I thought it was perfectly fine.
I think that's a good point. We're looking now at the Timeform US pace projector. You can see that on your screen that I'm sharing here. And number one, Looking at Lee, projected far enough back that he's not even in the frame of the pace projector. And as Jay points out, that might be a way to have that post become a lot less relevant than if you were looking at a horse who was going to have to gain position going forward and might be compromised by that inside draw. Jay, is this a horse, Looking at Lee, who might end up on your ticket somewhere?
I could see him in the bottom parts of gimmicks like for tries and supers. He's certainly the kind of horse who can run on, and he acts like the kind of horse who has been wanting more distance with every race. So I could certainly see scenarios where he's going to fill out some gimmicks.
Craig, where do you stand on looking at Lee? He's a horse who, in his races, has certainly made some moves, like he had the opportunity to finish and hasn't quite gotten there, but is perhaps the
Scenario.
Yeah, he's a horse for me that I would never use in the top halves. We have him listed with a running style of plotter, which is a big negative for me. He never gets into the race soon enough to get up close, but he could certainly fill out some tries in supers. That's about as much as I'd use him in here.
That seems like a logical opinion, which you guys both seem to share. Maybe one to leave in for third and fourth, but difficult to see cracking the exacta based on the body of work in terms of speed figures and running style. Let's move on to the number 2 horse in the race. This is Thunder Snow. And Thunder Snow, an interesting item. I know there was a lot of talk this week about whether or not Thunder Snow would be getting Lasix at the time of entries. He is listed with Lasix for Saeed bin Saror and Godolphin. Craig, how do you go about evaluating a horse like Thunder Snow? Timeform, of course, has the ability to compare your speed figures with the Timeform figures on a little bit more of an apples-to-apples basis. Where does Thunder Snow land on your reckoning of this year's Kentucky Derby?
Not very well, actually. He shows 106 and 107 time form figures in our past performances. In DRF, they're a little bit different, which is a whole nother explanation, but not enough to matter. Those probably translate to buyers in the mid 80s, maybe upper 80s, which just isn't going to cut it here. And on top of that, he's a horse that likes to be fairly close to the pace, if not on it. And I made some speed figures and pace figures for the Dubai races, and he's just a couple of these, in my opinion.
Jay, this is a horse where I'm really interested in how he appears in the flesh. Did you get an opportunity this week to see Thunder Snow? Does he appear to be adapting well to the demands of North American racing?
I don't know if he's adapting well to the demands of North American racing, but in the 2 days he's been on the track, he's looked perfectly fine in his gallops. But I share Craig's sentiments that if you look at the form of the horses that he basically, if you play off of Master Plan in the UAE Derby, who was only beaten about a length and a quarter, a length and a half, and is a horse that I don't think anybody would take seriously as a horse in the Derby if he were to draw in from the AE list. I mean, that's basically who Thunder Snow just beat with, I thought, a fairly good trip, while quite green while running through the stretch. So to me, he needs to improve quite a bit to be a factor, though he has looked very well in terms of, physically. That I'll say.
One thing that gave me pause about him was we all know how the Kentucky Derby has been on the Godolphin bucket list, if you will, and the fact that there was so much hemming and hawing after the UAE Derby as to whether or not Thunder Snow was even going to appear, that gave me a little bit of pause. I felt like if he was truly doing well and the type of horse who was going to thrive in this environment, that Godolphin would have had a little more enthusiasm for the spot. Do you think that's a fair criticism of this horse, Jay?
No, not really. I mean, all the information I was getting from people who knew is that he was always intended for the race, and that's what I was reporting. So it seems to me like he was always coming. They just wanted to make the announcement themselves, but all the back channel information that they were giving out was that they were always coming.
That's good to know if anybody was on the fence about the horse. But I'm showing now on the screen number 22, Master Plan, and I think that speaks well to Jay's point of not exactly a horse who, if he were to draw in, would be considered among the favorites. And this horse was within 2 lengths of Thunder Snow. So there's a lot of couple of different ways you can look at it, but seems like everybody on this call anyway leaning a little bit against when it comes to the chances of our first UAE winner of the Kentucky Derby. Let's move on to number 3, Fast and Accurate. This is a horse whose trainer, Mike Maker, has just had so much success over the last few years and has been able to make the right decision in so many instances when it comes to both surface for horses and distance for horses. There's a small part of me that wants to say, hey, in Maker we trust. If he's putting this horse in this race, maybe I can leave this horse in for third and fourth. But I'm not really seeing a whole lot on the paper to back up that assertion. Craig, we'll start with you with Fast and Accurate. Is there anything? Is there more here than meets the eye?
No, there's less, I think. He's a horse. His one dirt race was just dreadful. I respect Mike Maker as a trainer, but of course, I think everybody's eyes get a little big when it comes to the Derby. And seeing I've heard that they intend to send this horse to the lead, I'm not sure if he can make it or not. He hasn't really shown that kind of speed. But if there was one horse I could bet if I was in Vegas in a prop that would finish last with that information, it would probably be him.
Yeah, that does seem to have pop and stop written all over it. Jay, anything to add on Fast and Accurate?
No, I think he's hopelessly overmatched.
All right. With that said, let's go on to number 4, Untrapped, 30-1 on the morning line. One of the Steve Asmussen contingent in this race. He'd shaped like a horse a little bit earlier on the Derby Trail, who might be able to finish and get a piece in a race like this. But he hasn't really been able to see out his races on the track. Jay, what are you seeing when you look at the PPs of a horse like Untrapped?
Yeah, your sentiment is what I see, Pete. A horse who, as the distances have increased, has had increasingly difficult times managing that. Now, he did add blinkers last time in the Arkansas Derby, and they're going to come back off, and that was the only time he's worn blinkers. And his previous races without blinkers were better, but I was not a big fan of Malagasy going into the Arkansas Derby, and that's who Untrapped had finished behind in the Rebel, and I'm not sure that the fairgrounds horses match up well against other regions coming into this year's Derby, and that's where he was when racing against the likes of Gervin and Guest Suite. So I'm against him. I just think the distance and the competition are too steep.
Craig, we're showing Untrapped's PP on time form now, complete with the pace figures for the whole running line. When you're looking at this horse, is there anything you can see to recommend him, at least on the bottom of people's tickets, or is this one you're looking to avoid as well?
No, I'm avoiding this guy. I mean, he's been losing ground in the last furlong after making moves that just has hung badly both times. And he's a horse, frankly, to me, looks like a 7 furlong, 1-turn mile kind of horse. And I think he has some success if they cut him back there. But in this race, no, he won't be on my tickets.
All right, let's go on to a horse who could be among the favorites. There's been a lot of stories, even stories moving into the mainstream press about Always Dreaming with his based on his connections. Is this a horse who deserves his status at the top of the market? As recently as 2 races ago, people were questioning how fast he really was, if he had the ability to hang with the likes of these. Craig, this is one I really want you to talk about from a pace figure standpoint, looking at the Timeform USPP right now. We see lots of numbers coded in blue. Does that give you pause about Always Dreaming, or are you more tempted to take the last running line at face value and maybe project some improvement for this Todd Pletcher runner?
Yeah, it would give me pause. And as a matter of fact, it did before the Florida Derby. I was against him, but he certainly proved me wrong that day. He blew away what was a pretty decent field there. I sat close to honest fractions. We have one pace figures in the 120s. He did it easily, and he just looks like a really good horse. I almost look at those other races now like workouts where he wasn't really asked for anything, just kind of getting some fitness. And the 121 speed figure we gave him that day puts him right up there with anybody in this field. And I think he's got a shot.
Have you ever noticed, Craig, looking at your pace figures and your final figures, when a horse improves in both categories so radically as Always Dreaming did in the Florida Derby? What does that mean? Is that a suggestion of a horse who might experience some regression to the mean, or is that does that indicate a horse who's maybe just improving at the right time?
Yeah, with younger, lightly raced horses like this one, it's usually just improvement. That's what we expect out of 3-year-olds. If they're going to be good, they get better. And like I said, I think he could have ran much better his first 2 if he had to, but the fields were just so overmatched and he wasn't really asked for much. And I'm going to base most of what I think of this horse on his last race in the Florida Derby.
Jay, there's been so much made of Todd Pletcher and his relative lack of success in the Kentucky Derby compared to his overall unbelievable numbers. Is that something that you put any stock in when you're looking at a race like the Kentucky Derby, or are you more inclined to just look at the horse's numbers and say that they are what they are?
Well, it just depends on the horse. I mean, there's been many horses that I think he has had to run because of circumstances beyond his control. And that might be the case this year too with some of his horses, but not in the case specifically of Always Dreaming, who's earned his way into the race off a big performance in the Florida Derby. The day that he won the allowance race, this little allowance race, that was the same day as the Fountain of Youth. It was the first race of the day. The wind was blowing, the track was very deep and tiring, and he was running against really inferior horses. And it was a means to an end. So to me, the fig that he got that day is just immaterial to the whole process and the development of this horse. And his last race, I think, stamps him as one of the top players in this race. The only negative aspect of him this week is just he's been very aggressive in his training to the point where they've had to use draw reins and change exercise riders to try and get him to be a little more cooperative in the morning. And who knows what will happen when obviously he's not going to race in them on Saturday. So I think you're going to see a horse who's going to show a lot of speed, but maybe he's just so talented that he's going to run these horses off their feet. I ended up picking him second in the daily racing form.
Yeah, that's a great question about when you see a horse who's been that keen in his training. That doesn't sound like something that's going to necessarily mesh well with having to get 10 furlongs for the first time. But when the talent is there, it leaves a little bit of a conundrum in terms of how to treat him overall. It sounds like, is it fair to say, Jay, that you're leaning positive based on the talent level, despite how keen he's appeared on the track in the mornings?
Yes, that's why I said I picked him second in the paper.
Excellent. Yeah, second is pretty good when it comes to a race like the Kentucky Derby.
Second out of 20 was high.
Well, we'll call that.
His final work last Friday was very good.
Yeah, I got a chance to see some of that, and it did look like he was cooperating a bit more. Maybe it was a case of sort of getting him used to the task at hand. Certainly on my short list and on many people's short list for the big honors on Saturday, whether or not the distance is truly going to be his absolute best. Let's move on to number 6, State of Honor. This is another horse who you would assume would be up in the vanguard. He was no match for Always Dreaming in the Florida Derby, and has also seemed to have a little bit of trouble seeing out his races. If you could make a bet to the half-mile pole, you could maybe see this horse being in the mix. Is there any reason, Jay, that you've seen that he might be able to turn the tables on some of these rivals in this race who've handled him in the past?
I just don't think the race shape comes up good for him. He's outside of Always Dreaming, who I think has more speed based on the way he's been training and from where he is. And I just don't see him being able to sit off of Always Dreaming. He's under a rider who is not a send kind of rider in Lescano. And then out finishing not only Always Dreaming, but all the horses that are going to be making late runs. I don't know that the race comes up real good for him. The one thing that is in his favor is that he's looked as well as anybody from a training standpoint. But I'd seen him in Florida this winter a couple times, and he's a forward training kind of horse, so that's not unusual for him. I just think it's a tough race shape for him.
Craig, when we're looking at the time for him, pace projector, a State of Honor is the inside-most speed horse who projects to be up there. Just looking at the pace projector and trying to make a guess about who will be the best of the speed, do you give State of Honor a chance to be in contention late in this Kentucky Derby?
No, I give him a chance to make the early lead, but I think he'll be all done before they even get to the second turn. He's been beaten pretty consistently by a bunch of horses in here. It hasn't come particularly close. So I think he's just a pace factor. Don't really see him as any kind of contender.
Also, before we move on with the rest of the field, wanted to give another note from our sponsor about this 10% Oaks and Derby Exacta winners bonus. You can bet exactas in the Kentucky Oaks and Kentucky Derby on Naira Bets, and when you win, you receive a 10% winners bonus. How does it work? Let's say your Derby Exacta pays $200. Well, Naira Bets will add 20 on top of that. Wagers need to be made via mobile device to qualify. This promotion is available exclusively to Naira Bets customers only. Visit NairaBets.com to sign up today. Let's move on to number 7, Gervin. This is a horse who, it's been written, and I agree, if there was no such thing as speed figures, I feel like this horse would be considerably shorter than the 15-1 of his morning line. Craig, as a speed figure guy, are you seeing Gervin having a possibility to get a piece of this, or do you think, as the numbers suggest, he might find a few of these just a little bit too tough?
Yeah, I mean, he could get a piece on the lower end just because he's a tactical horse. He always seems to work out a decent trip for himself. But, that also gives you pause in that he's had really good trips at the fairgrounds in his races, and he still hasn't run particularly fast. He's not a horse I'll be betting on. And if he beats me, beats me. And, of course, there's Shoegate that I'm sure Jay will talk about a little bit too.
Jay, give us clue us into what Craig is talking about regarding Shoegate and Gervin.
Well, as I reported last week, he's had bar shoes on, and that's why he went over to Keeneland. It was not disclosed by his connections for several days after he first went over there, despite having several opportunities to disclose the reason he went over there, including on a national teleconference a week ago, Tuesday. It wasn't until Wednesday where I was able to ascertain enough information to call and ask about it, and was given obtuse and non-committal answers. And it wasn't until Thursday where they even admitted what I had written on Wednesday was accurate, that he was training in Z-Bar shoes. And I dare say if we hadn't reported that, I don't know if people would know even today that that's been going on, because they certainly were not going to be forthcoming about it when given several days to do it. He's had 2 works since the Louisiana Derby. He's had a foot problem. He doesn't have figures that measure up. He's beaten horses that we think are inferior compared to the top contenders in here. Patch was the horse second last time out, and Untrapped was second in the Risen Star, and we've covered his story arc. So I just don't see how it adds up for to me, he would have to be superior to this group to overcome what he's been put through to win the race, and he's not, in my opinion.
Makes perfect sense to me, and the type of information Jay is talking about here. Just another reason why it pays to be a DRF Plus subscriber and get all the fantastic up-to-the-minute information that Jay and the other reporters on the DRF team provide. I mean, you're really getting a perspective you can't get anywhere else, and especially if you're looking to bet on these races, you're at a disadvantage if you're not looking at it. Let's move on to number 8, Hence. Dare I say, Hence has the look, a little bit the look of a wise guy horse in this race, Jay, a horse who seems to be gaining support in some quarters. The Sunland Derby obviously has been a productive race. The Beyer Speed Figure team raised that figure a couple of points. Steve, we talked about the struggles that Pletcher's had in the Kentucky Derby. Steve Asmussen sort of in a similar boat. Is Hence a horse who might get him off the Kentucky Derby schneid?
I think he's got a chance. He's not a horse that I picked in the top 4, but I do respect his chances. The Sunland Derby has proven to be a better than it looked kind of race initially afterwards, or even going in. It just didn't look like it was that strong, but IRAP came out of it and won the Bluegrass. And Conquest Mo Money, who finished second, came back and was a very game second in the Arkansas Derby. So the form looks good. And Hence has trained very well here at Churchill Downs. His last work was quite good. He's galloped very well. He gets a little bit hot in the morning, but nothing to me that's alarming. And up until his last race, he certainly didn't look like the kind of horse that was going to be at this level. But horses can get very good at the right time, and he might be that. But you're taking it on a leap of faith that he's going to reproduce what he did last time. And that's why you're going to get a mid-level price here. To me, price matters with this horse. If he turns into the wise guy horse, there's not value there. If he's around his morning line or higher, then he's worth considering for gimmicks and things of that nature.
That certainly seems like a logical approach to him. I was wondering, with a trainer like Asmussen, when you see them ship to the Sunland Derby, they're not necessarily shipping to the Sunland Derby because they think that's their Kentucky Derby horse. But as fast as things can change with 3-year-olds in the spring and the way the race has played out, he certainly has to be considered at least a little bit. Craig, how does he look on the Timeform US data, and where do you stand with Hence in general?
I'm very lukewarm on Hence, to be honest. I realize they've had some good performances come out of the Sunland Derby. And one of the things I do a lot is I go and dig through the charts, and I'm constantly looking for races that, maybe I got the rating wrong and was faster. But really, the top two, Conquest Mo Money said came back and ran well, and Irap obviously won the Bluegrass. But there's been some others in that field that have come back as well and haven't run particularly good. So I think it's just a matter of two horses happen to be going in the right direction and ran bigger races next out more so than the Sunland Derby with some great key race. I don't have him as particularly fast, and I suspect, like you did, that he's going to be the wise guy horse and get bet. And I actually prefer some of the other closers to him.
All right, let's move on. You mentioned, Craig, number 9, E-Rap. We can easily hop over to him. We can see on the Timeform pace projector that he does not appear to be in the among the top 3 speeds, shall we say. Obviously, he outran his odds in the Bluegrass. I can't say that it was a visually impressive effort with him kind of hanging on his wrong lead down the stretch. Are you seeing anything in the numbers, however, that stamp E-Rap as a contender for connections who've obviously had success in the Kentucky Derby in the past?
He's actually kind of a different horse than Always Dreaming that we talked about, and that he ran the big numbers last time that he's never really run in the past, especially final time. And that's generally a horse I avoid in the Derby, where the race just kind of comes out of nowhere. I mean, these horses always seem to get bet more than I think they will. And, I don't know if it's a quirky Keeneland track or he just didn't look that good to me, even though he was winning the race. He was running a little erratically, and he's not one that I'll be on. I don't think he's going to be able to get as close as he'd like to be early without using up too much energy. So I'm going to look elsewhere.
Jay, where do you stand with E-Rap? Was that last race a new level of ability, or is this a horse who you expect to regress a little bit here in the Derby?
I just don't know what to make of him because there were so many horses in the Bluegrass who were, I think, better than they showed that day, and he certainly took advantage of it. And I had seen him in California several times where he just was not good enough to beat horses like Royal Mo and the Robert Lewis, and he was a well-beaten second behind Mastery in the La Salle Futurity. And don't forget, the Bluegrass was his breakthrough win for the first time of his life. The thing that's interesting or intriguing about him, on form, it's kind of hard to warm up to him. He looks really, really good in person, just physically. He's just grown into a grand animal. And Tisnows by nature are usually later developing kind of horses. So maybe he's getting good at the right time. I'm really betwixt and between on how to handle him, because on the dope, on the paper, it's other than his last race, which there's plenty of questions about in terms of what everybody else did. He's hard to warm up to, but he really makes a striking appearance in person. And I've seen a lot of him since he made his debut 6.5 months ago.
Well, that makes sense, and I think that's a great point you make about Tisnows in general, and you look from a Stormcat mare and what he cost at auction. You can certainly make a case that this is just a good late developing horse. Might be easier to conjure the case if the race shape fit him a little bit better, at least based on looking at the Timeform pace projector, and that leads nicely into a question we had come in about number 10, Gunnevara, and this is one I'll give both you guys a crack at answering this question because I think that each of you will have a perspective on each half of it. And the question asked that Gunavera comes in here tied for the best late pace in the field, and comes out of a race that maybe didn't set up for him so well. Does that mean, Craig, you think he might bounce back at a price? And then there was a specific question for Jay as well in terms of how he's looking in the training. So we'll start with you, Craig. When you see a horse in a race like this that has so much speed, Timeform's coded it as a fast pace, and you've got that big late pace number that you can see here within Timeform and also now in the new Timeform early and late pace ratings that appear both in the paper and the classic DRFPPs. Does that late pace number give Gunavera a chance to pull an upset here, Craig?
Yeah, I think it does. He's a horse I like. I actually picked him second in the racing form. And yeah, he's one that the last race was a bit puzzling. You know, he dropped way out in the Fountain of Youth and made that huge run to just blow the field away at the end. And I don't know if the plan was that, you know, he had enough points, so let's not kill him in the Florida Derby. But they dropped way out again. But the difference was the pace wasn't nearly as fast. I mean, it wasn't a slow pace. It was solid. But he was just way too far back, and he still made his usual late run. And I think in the Derby, they're going to keep him a little bit closer. He had never shown that, you know, he's just a plotter who drops off the screen at the beginning of the race. He's usually, you know, within eyesight. He's a closer, no doubt, but he's shown more early speed than that. So, you know, assuming I am keen to hear what Jay has to say about the horse and his training, because I hadn't heard much on him, but he's definitely one I'm interested in using.
You know, I haven't heard much either, and what I've heard hasn't been particularly flattering, just in terms of how he appears as an individual compared to some of the more statuesque Derby contenders. But let's leave that speculation aside and let's go to the guy who's actually clapped eyes on the horse this week. Jay, how is Gunavera looking out there at Churchill Downs?
He's not the kind of horse that's going to take your breath away when he comes on the racetrack. He's kind of a plain-looking horse. His final workout to me was fine. You have to take it in perspective. He's a closing horse. He's not a speed horse, so he's less likely to wow you with a workout. And he works himself. And a lot of times horses need company to show even more. And his gallops since have been okay. So there's just nothing that he's done on the track that I think would change your perspective on him one way or the other. I mean, if you like him already, it's not like he's done anything to tout you off of him. But if you were against him, he hasn't really done anything to make you change your mind and say, geez, maybe I ought to reconsider.
Fair enough. We're halfway through the main body of the field. Going to take another second out here to give a word from our sponsor, Naira Bets, about the 1, 2, 3, 4 million point hit and split. Earn more points at Churchill on Derby Week with the Naira Bets 1, 2, 3, 4 million point giveaway starting Thursday. Hit the Churchill late pick 4 and split 1 million points. On Friday, late pick 4 winners split 2 million points. And on Derby Day, all stakes pick 4 winners split 3 million points. If you hit the Churchill pick 4 on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, Naira Bets members will split 4 million points. Find details on this and all Derby Week wagering promotions at NairaBets.com. Naira Bets, racing's best play. And with that, let's move to the second half of the main body of the field, and that's Battle of Midway, coming out of the much maligned Santa Anita Derby. Obviously, many years, the Santa Anita Derby, a key Derby prep. This year, it seems like a lot of prognosticators are turning their nose up at the form of the Santa Anita Derby. Jay, you know these horses. Where do you stand on the overall form of the Santa Anita Derby and on Battle of Midway in particular?
So I thought Battle of Midway, in the context of the race itself, ran a very good race because it was a hot pace and he hung around and Gormley got a perfect trip and just ran him down late. And I don't think he needs to be on that kind of a pace. He had an inside draw that day, post 3 of 13, and they used him early. But in his prior races, he settled a little bit off the pace. And I think because of where he's drawn here, that's where he'll be. I don't envision him being used as aggressively in this race as he was in the Santa Anita Derby. But I still think it's a tall order for him. He made his debut as a 3-year-old, and you got to I really do think that the fact that no horse has won the Kentucky Derby without a start at age 2 since 1882 is a significant factor. There's something to trying to cram in this much development in a short amount of time. And I also find it interesting that Rick Porter, who's never won the Kentucky Derby, was willing to sell this horse after the Santa Anita Derby. Now, the people who bought him are breeders, and this horse has a great pedigree, but we're just talking about May the 6th from a handicapping standpoint. And from that standpoint, I like others more.
No, it makes sense to me. Craig, when you see a horse like this, we're looking at the time form PP right now. We're seeing how the last race was coded in red. Does that make you want to upgrade this horse beyond the raw figures, or are you still held back with the same kind of limitation? Do you think he has the same kind of limitations that Jay was describing?
Yeah, well, we do upgrade him. Our speed figures work a little bit differently in that we account for pace. And you can see that he ran a 109 final time figure, but we upgrade that to an overall 115. So it's kind of built in already. He's a horse. I thought the same thing as Jay said. I wrote it a couple weeks ago when I did a piece on the pace projector when we didn't even know who the field was going to be. And I had mentioned, even though this horse was battling through fast fractions, the way he's running the past, he's not a horse I really expect to be on the lead. I think he was kind of a victim of circumstance. He got caught on the inside, and it was either go or get shuffled back. So I think this post is good for him. He'll probably sit just off of him. The thing is, I'm just not sure if he's good enough to win a race like this. I did wind up picking him 4th in the daily racing form just because normally if this was a regular everyday race and he was just coming back, he's the kind of horse I love, a horse who, won the battle but lost the war. But in this context, it's probably going to be a quick pace again. And while he may not necessarily be a part of it, he's going to be fairly close. And the finish of that race, watching those horses stagger down the stretch is still kind of burned in my mind. And I'm just not sure he's good enough to really be right there at the finish. But I do think he'll run well.
Be nice to see a little bit more finishing ability, which doesn't really come through in the pace figures on a horse like Battle of Midway. Let's move on to number 12, Sonneteer, one of the later additions to the field. Still a maiden, a horse who has shown a little bit of an ability to finish. You give this guy, Craig, any shot to round out the 4?
Sure. To me, he's almost the same exact horse as Looking at Lee. The only difference is one is being ridden by Kent DeSormo and the other by, I think it's Corey Lannery. And no offense to Corey Lannery, he's a fine rider, but in a race like the Derby, I don't mind. I'd rather have Kent DeSormo. He's going to do the right thing most of the time. And if anybody can work out a trip from back there, I would put my money on Kent. So I don't necessarily think he's going to break his maiden in the Derby, but if he was to run 3rd or 4th, it certainly wouldn't surprise me.
Jay, do you give Sonneteer any count to make any impact in this year's race?
I kind of agree with Craig in terms of the ceiling of what he can do, and that's maybe to be a clunk up horse to get part of the gimmicks with horse. He'll at least be running late. There'll be a lot of horses who are going to have chucked it the last quarter mile, and in scenarios like that, horses like him can get up and finish out part of the gimmicks. But I just can't see in any way how he could do better than that.
There aren't a whole lot of horses in this year's Kentucky Derby who've cracked the 100 buyer speed figure threshold. Jay Boy's Echo is one of those. Granted, he did it in the Gotham with a pretty good setup and probably racing on the best part of the track, one of several horses in the Bluegrass who didn't show his form. Are you seeing anything in person, Jay, or on the paper to make you think that Jay Boy's Echo can reverse form and run back to that Gotham and be a major player in this year's Kentucky Derby?
So I thought in the Gotham he had a pretty sweet trip that day. In evaluating the Bluegrass, other than getting bumped around a little bit at the start, I just never thought he fired. His work last week for him was pretty good. He's a pretty indifferent workhorse. But I was not crazy about how he looked on the track this morning. So unless he shows something more over the next couple mornings, I just wonder if maybe he's starting to go the wrong way. So as of right now, I'm against him.
I think that's fair based on everything we're seeing on the paper from J Boy's Echo. How about you, Craig? How do you evaluate him? Are you in the same boat with Jay and basically where I am as well, or do you see some positives here that are maybe a little more hidden?
Now, he's a horse. I know you're familiar with our PPs. Sometimes we'll note that maybe the speed figure has some question marks behind it, and the Gotham was one of those. I made a notation that even though I gave him a 118, which equates to about a 98 to 100 buyer, so we were similar. I had reservations. I just didn't trust it, and nothing that's come back from that race has made me change my mind. He had some problems at the start of the Bluegrass, but he just never really looked very good. And he's a horse I'm willing to toss, and if he beats me, he beats me.
Classic Empire is the 2-year-old champion who seemed to reclaim a little bit of his luster in the last race in the Arkansas Derby. Is this a horse who can move forward again, Craig, and justify that spot at the top of the market? Or is he maybe a horse who's had a few too many things go wrong along the way? Where do you stand with our favorite Classic Empire?
Can he? Sure, he certainly can, but he's not a horse I'm going to be betting. I mean, the favorites won, what, 4 years in a row? I think every year since the point system's been in place. But this is still a race where I'm not going to be looking to bet the favorite in a 20-horse field. I'm going to look to beat him. And I think if you're betting on Classic Empire, you're betting that he can get back to his BC juvenile, which was a huge effort. It was the fastest juvenile I can remember in several years from a speed figure standpoint. But even though he won the Arkansas Derby, I mean, I just wasn't blown away. I wasn't, it wasn't like it didn't stamp Derby favorite to me. So I'm willing to take a shot against him. And with all the training he's missed, kind of like Jay said about horses having trouble winning when there's a 2-year-old, you don't hear about many horses winning the Derby that missed a lot of training leading up to it.
That's fair enough. Jay, as somebody who covers the race, I figure you love a horse like Classic Empire. He's created so much drama along the way. He's obviously got so much talent, but putting aside the story that is Classic Empire, how do you rate his chances?
So I'm a little more bullish on him than Craig is. I picked him third in the racing form. And the way I look at the Arkansas Derby is he had no business winning that race based on the interrupted training that he'd had, the brief workout schedule that he had coming into the race after he had balked at working out at Palm Meadows. And to me, to overcome all that in his first start in more than 2 months, and the one start prior, being just a non-effort in the Holy Bull from which he emerged with a foot abscess, to me was it was a remarkable performance for him to win that race. And we know that he's, at least last fall, was the best of this generation when his form in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile was sensational. It was a fast race. He beat a good but ill-fated horse, and not this time. And it was way back to everybody else. So I liked his last race a lot more than Craig did. His training since then has been solid but not spectacular. His workout was adequate. His gallops have been fine, but he hasn't done anything that's made you go like, wow. Now he is coming back in 3 weeks, so they don't want to overcook him. So I think he's capable of winning the race, but there are 2 others that I ended up putting above him. But I respect him. I do think he has a chance to win the race.
Now, you talked about workouts. Obviously, I'm not at Churchill Downs. I'm hunkered down here in the Brooklyn bunker, but I do have access to the internet. And while I'd much prefer to watch Works live, I still will watch Works on video. And I was very impressed with McCracken's most recent piece of work. I don't know if you had a chance to see it live, Jay, but this was a horse to me who just vibed happy and healthy and sitting on a big race, something that makes a lot of sense given the hands he's in as well. Ian Wilkes, of course, part of a team who's produced other Derby winners who theoretically at least underperformed in the Bluegrass and delivered their best shot on Derby Day. I'm finding myself very attracted to the story that McCracken might be able to do the same thing. What have you thought of McCracken getting to see him in the flesh, and where do you stand on him for this year's Kentucky Derby?
Yeah, so I did see his last work, as I reported in the paper when he breezed over the weekend. I thought it was a terrific work. He's come back and trained fine coming out of it. And as I wrote in the comments for the grid that I did with Mike Watchmaker, it's our Derby watch style grid, but on all 20 horses for the Derby. I've seen this movie before. I've seen Ian Wilkes, as you were just alluding to, take something off the fastball in the final prep and then come forward on the big day. He did it with Fort Larned for the Breeders' Cup Classic. His mentor, Carl Nafsker, was as good as I've ever seen at pulling it off. Most memorably remembered for how he handled Unbridled and Street Sense in their Derby wins. And when you think back to what they had done in their final preps and how much they improved. And I just think this horse is going to move forward a lot off of that bluegrass, in which he had kind of a compromised trip and he had a little bit of a training setback before that. And I just think you're going to see a much improved effort on Saturday from him.
Craig, looking at the Timeform US data on McCracken, maybe putting aside the information about how he's training and the history his trainer has bringing horses up to big races, what do you think of this horse on paper, and what do you expect on Saturday?
He's a horse I like. I actually have a little soft spot. I went to Tampa this year and saw him win the Sam Davis. It was the first time I'd been there. And, I was impressed by him. I was disappointed when he had his minor setback, but like I said, it was minor. I think he was probably only going to have one more prep anyway. It was going to be the Tampa Bay Derby instead of the Bluegrass. I doubt he would have run again.
That's not true. He was going to run in both.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't sure, but so maybe it's a little bit of a setback, but probably not as much as I think Classic Empire had. But, he was a little keen last time. It was unusual for him to be so close. I think he's going to revert back to his style of coming from a bit farther out of it. He does, he's not a stone cold closer. I don't expect him to be 20 lengths behind. But I think he'll work out a good trip. He's a horse I didn't pick in my top 4, but I easily could have. I like the horse, and it'll just depend on the odds board how much I use him on my tickets.
Tapwrit's another one of these horses who seemingly underperformed in the Bluegrass. It's hard to bet a horse in the Kentucky Derby coming off a clunker, which is, I think charitably how I can best describe Tapwrit's last race. Before that, he'd been very impressive to me. Craig, where do you stand with him as far as this year's race?
I'm not a fan of his. Like I said, I was at the Davis, and I've watched that race a few times, and I think he more won the Tampa Bay Derby by default. After watching him in the Davis, I never got the impression he could beat McCracken if those two had a, fair chance against each other. And then, the clunker, I just don't like that coming into the Derby. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can't think of too many horses that ran a race that bad looking on the past performances that have come back to win the Derby.
Jay, I'll ask you that same question. Do you think it's possible to overcome a race like Tapwrit's Bluegrass and make an impact in a race like the Kentucky Derby?
I do, because Thunder Gulch has the exact same kind of line coming into the Kentucky Derby. He just didn't fire at all. I thought he had a little bit of a compromised trip, but he certainly just didn't show up that day. So then you have to ask yourself, all right, let's see how he does coming out of that. And he's trained great. His last workout last week was terrific. His gallops since have been fantastic. And he, to me, is a very live horse at a price. I picked him 4th. I neglected to mention when we were talking about McCracken. That ended up being my top pick in the paper. But I have Tapwrit strongly represented. I made him my 4th pick in the 1, 2, 3, 4s that we had to turn in. And I think I definitely will be using him because I think he's going to outrun his odds.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Irish Warcry, another one of the runners who has a place at the top of the market, seemed to reclaim his place there with a visually, I thought, nice effort in the wood, and from what I'm hearing, has been doing well since then, certainly in good hands with Derby-winning trainer Graham Motion. What's the latest news, Jay, on Irish Warcry, and how serious are you taking him?
No, he's definitely made a great impression since he's been here. I thought his wood was solid. I thought he had a perfect trip, but certainly it made his previous race just look like an outlier. Because other than that, he's 4 for 4. And he just didn't show up in the race where he chucked it in the Fountain of Youth. So he certainly is a main player. I think this horse has a chance to end up being the betting favorite in the race. I think there's a lot of momentum for him in the market, and I think he could be favored. I think he can win. If we'd have had to rank him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's who I would have put fifth. He's the one I ended up leaving out. So I respect him as a win horse, but I think he's going to be a little shorter price than you might have thought a couple of weeks ago. And I don't know that he's going to get quite as perfect a trip as I thought he got in the Wood Memorial. And the history of the Wood in recent years has been quite poor. So I totally get people who like him, but I'm going to try and use others and hope that he can only finish as good as maybe fifth, and I catch a super without him in it.
Craig, the Timeform PPs give Irish Warcry an excuse for the race 2 back that doesn't appear in the traditional running lines in terms of those crazy early pace figures that he was very close to. Is that enough for you to excuse him and accept him as among the most likely winners here? Or like Jay, are you seeing him as a horse who's maybe still just had some pretty good trips and might find a couple of these too tough?
No, that race actually scares me from on a negative way because the pace is not going to be slow in the Derby. You can forget that if anybody thinks. I'm sure they don't. But, I mean, he ran 140 pace figures that day, and that's probably what we're going to see again on Saturday. Maybe a little slower, maybe a little faster. And, he was up there, and look, he's not a horse that's going to come from 5 or 6 lengths back. He's always been close in every single one of his races, other than his first time out when he was a maiden and, it was just green. But he's a horse that wants to be up close, and that's kind of in my memory where he was up close, and the one time he faced a fast pace, he folded up like a cheap tent and finished. I think he might have been, he was way back. He wasn't last, but he was well back. Gunnevera blew him away that day. He was aided by the pace, but again, I think we're going to get a similar pace set up in the Derby. It's going to be pretty fast up front, and he's going to be close. And with his post, he's probably going to lose a few lengths of ground around the first turn. So I think he's a really good horse. I just don't think things are going to set up for him on Saturday.
Let's talk about number 18, Gormley, 15-1 on the morning line for John Sheriffs and Victor Espinoza. We've seen some years where jockeys catch an awful lot of money who've had recent success in the Kentucky Derby. I sort of had it in the back of my mind that Gormley might be the one to do that this year. He showed a new dimension, being able to rate a little bit more and pounce in the Santa Anita Derby, a race that I don't think any of the three of us think all that much of. Is there a chance you could see using Gormley on your tickets here, Craig?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, racing's a humbling game. He's a horse that, when I heard the last time they said they were going to take him back and rate, I kind of snickered, like, why in the world would you do that? So, of course, I tossed him out and he wins the race. But, like you said, he didn't run particularly fast. I don't even think he was one of the 2 best horses in the Santa Anita Derby. He was probably 3rd at best. So, if he comes from off the pace, yeah, you could maybe put him in the bottom parts of supers, but he's not one I'm interested in.
Craig referring, I think, to the pace in there. You can see it coded in the Timeform US pace figures where, according to most pace theory, a horse like Gormley had the best of it as opposed to the horses who were cutting out the teeth of that pace. Jay, where do you stand on Gormley?
So I thought he had as good a trip as you could ever get in the Santa Anita Derby, sitting 4th behind 3 dueling speed horses, and he needed every length of the stretch to get up and win the race. I do think he has a chance to move forward off that race because I have a lot of respect for his trainer, John Sheriffs, to produce a horse who's going to move forward off preps and use them as building blocks. But I still think he's got too far to come to be a win threat or maybe even a gimmick threat in this race. So as much as I respect the connections, I'm going to be playing against him.
Practical Joke number 19 seems to do nothing but finish in the money in graded stakes races. But Jay, a lot of people seem to think this 1.25 mile distance might be beyond his limitations. This is a horse who a lot of people think will be in the hunt at the pace call. You think there's any chance that Practical Joke might see out the trip and be the one laughing at the pundits at the end of this?
No, not if you've been reading what I've been consistently writing about him from the very beginning of our Derby Watch stuff nearly 3 months ago now. I just think he's much better as a one-run, one-turn sprinter. I think he just can't punch it in when he goes 2 turns as effectively. He didn't finish off his race well in the Fountain of Youth. He had the whole length of the stretch to get by IRAP last time and couldn't do it. And now he's got to try and go out to 1.25 miles, which I think is beyond his range, from a bad box. It just doesn't add up for him, for me.
Sounds about right as far as I'm concerned. Craig, any disagreement on our friend Practical Joke?
No, I mean, distance obviously concern for him. I was impressed a little bit with it. Not impressed, but I mean, I was surprised at his last race that he hung. He sure looked like he was going to win the whole length of the stretch, and he just couldn't get by. But he is one I think will work out a good trip, and he wouldn't surprise me again, if he was able to get 3rd or 4th in a race like this. But in the end, Jay's probably right in the fact that he would be a horse who maybe later in the year could run in Cigar Mile and races like that. That might be more his strong suit.
Number 20 is Patch, another Todd Pletcher runner, another Calumet Farm runner. Craig, what are you seeing on Patch, and do you think he has a chance to make an impact?
I don't. He's a good story. He's the horse that's missing an eye, and you always have to have a little soft spot for that. But he comes out of that slow Louisiana Derby where he couldn't even get by Gervin, a horse who I'm not interested in. So from way outside in the parking lot there in the 20 post, I just don't see it.
Anything to add on Patch, Jay?
No, I agree with Craig. I just think it's a tall order. He's only had 3 starts, so he's the least experienced horse in the field. He has a terrible post position. He was outworked by Taproot in a team drill over the weekend. I just don't see this as being a good idea, and I think he has a chance to be a nice horse down the line, and I just hope this doesn't set him back too far. I do think he's going to be an underlay because he, as Craig was alluding to, he's become a very popular horse because of his missing the eye, and there's been a lot of copy on him. And Todd Pletcher told me he's been getting a lot of media inquiries from the UK and all over the United States, and so I think that might translate into him getting a little more mutual support just from all the squares betting on him. But I just don't see any way that he ends up being in the superfecta at all.
We've seen that phenomenon in past years, whether it was folks seemingly betting on whoever Calvin was on after he had that success, or folks betting on Rosie Napravnik because of her great story. It does seem to me like a horse like Patch with the narrative attached, or a horse like Gormley with Espinoza riding after his recent success could fall into that. Guys, we've just got about 2 minutes left. I want to do some rapid fire questions from our great audience who's been peppering throughout. Most of them we've handled just throughout the course of talking about the field, but there are a couple here I want to ask. Jay, the first one's for you. Who are the top 2 or 3 horses you've seen who've looked the best on the track this week?
Wow, I would say Taproot would certainly be one of them. Irish War Cry has looked very, very well. I guess those would be my top 2. But no knocks certainly on McCracken's last work and the way he's trained as well. So I guess those would be the ones for me. And Always Dreaming. Those would be, to answer that question, those are the ones that come top of mind.
Craig, here's one for you. Who do you think the best 2 or 3 closers are in this year's Kentucky Derby?
The best 2 or 3 closers, I go with Gunnevera, McCracken, and then it's probably a toss-up. Maybe the Maiden Sonneteer would be 3rd.
All right, here's a question for Jay about the rain. If it rains before or during the Derby, how do we think that might change the dynamics of the race, if at all? Are there any horses who you're particularly interested in if we're looking at a slop fest?
It's really an impossible question to answer because you just don't know how much rain it's going to take and when, and whether you're going to get a drying out track that's going to be a tiring, deep, sucking the shoes off of a horse kind of track, or one that's just a sloppy track that's got a real firm bottom that horses just skip over, like, for instance, the kind of track there was when Smarty Jones won, when there was an absolute deluge, but the bottom held up, and unless you were if you were they ran 1-2 the whole way around. So I don't want to dodge that question, but it's just really an impossible question to answer until you see how the track is playing and how much rain it gets earlier on Saturday.
Anything to add, Craig, to that question about the weather before we let you go? We had several questions about the weather and how it might affect things. Anything you're seeing from your perspective that might change based on the weather conditions?
No, I just try to adapt on the fly. I watch the earlier races, see how the track's playing, like Jay said. And even with a race like the Derby, I think there's 90 minutes between. So if the track's off, I'm sure they're going to be working on it the whole time, trying to get it in good shape as best they can. So for the most part, I'm going to count on a fair track, even if it's a bit wet.
All right, guys, that's all the time we have. I want to thank Craig Milkowski. I want to thank Jay Privman. Most of all, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Lots of great questions and tremendous viewership. If anybody wants to go back and check out this show again, you can do so. It's going to be archived in a few minutes at drf.com/YouTube. Feel free to hit us up with questions on Twitter after the fact. Happy to keep the conversation going. I want to thank once again our sponsor, Naira Bets. Remind folks about the $200 sign-up bonus, the 10% Oaks and Derby exacta winners bonus, and the 1, 2, 3, 4 million point hit split. Check out NairaBets.com for all the information on that. I'm Peter Thomas Fornital, and you've been watching a handicapping session produced by DRF.com.